Eckhart Tolle, if you're spiritually awake, never reveal these 7 things to anyone. So, you think you're spiritually awake? Think again. Most people who talk about their awakening haven't actually awakened at all. They've just given their ego a brand new spiritual identity, a shiny new badge to defend. This is one of Eckhart Tolle's most crucial warnings. And recent psychological research from 2024 and 2025 has confirmed what he's been teaching for decades. Spiritual narcissism is real, measurable, and far more common than anyone wants to admit. Research published in Scientific American confirms spiritual narcissism as a genuine psychological phenomenon, where the ego becomes pathologically fixated on what it perceives as spiritual greatness. The study even found that mind-body practices, meditation, yoga, energy work can actually increase self-centrality and self-enhancement when the ego co-opts the awakening process. Let me be direct. If you're truly on the path of awakening, there are 7 critical things you must never reveal to anyone. Not because these things are secret, but because sharing them allows the ego to hijack your spiritual progress for self-glorification. Tolle warns that it takes only a moment of inattention for the ego to transform genuine presence into spiritual superiority. And once that happens, you haven't transcended the ego. You've just dressed it in robes and given it a fancy meditation cushion. The first thing you must never reveal: your mystical experiences. When you have a genuine mystical experience, a moment of oneness consciousness, a boundary dissolution between self and universe, a direct perception of reality beyond form, your first instinct might be to share it. Just don't. Tolle explains that mystical experiences create what researchers call ineffability barriers, the fundamental inability to express subjective spiritual experiences with any accuracy. Language evolved to describe objects, separation, and survival. It has no adequate vocabulary for non-dual awareness. But here's what happens when you try to share anyway. The ego rushes in to own the experience. The moment you say, "I had this incredible awakening," or "I experienced oneness consciousness," the ego has already created a narrative where I is the protagonist of a spiritual achievement story. Research from 2025 on contemplative neuroscience shows that talking about mystical experiences activates the default mode network, the exact brain structure associated with self-referential thinking, the same thinking that meditation is supposed to quiet. In other words, describing your awakening literally reactivates the ego structure that awakening transcends. Tolle says most people never recognize this trap. They have a genuine moment of presence, then immediately convert it into a story about themselves having presence. The experience becomes a possession, something the ego can show off, compare, and use to establish hierarchy. Watch what happens in spiritual communities. People compete over who had the deepest meditation, the most intense Kundalini awakening, the clearest vision of light. This isn't spirituality. It's ego decoration. True mystical experience doesn't need testimony. It transforms your being from the inside out. If you need to talk about it, you're probably trying to convince yourself or others that something significant happened. Silence protects the experience from becoming just another object the ego possesses. The second thing you must never reveal: your level of consciousness. Nothing reveals spiritual narcissism faster than people announcing their consciousness level. "I'm operating at 500 on the Hawkins scale. I've reached the causal plane. My chakras are fully activated." Tolle would ask a simple question: who is claiming this achievement? The moment you identify with a consciousness level, you've created a new form of ego identification. You haven't transcended the self. You've just given the self a spiritual ranking system. Research on the psychology of spiritual development from 2024 shows that people who claim high consciousness levels demonstrate measurably higher narcissistic traits than those who don't make such claims. The study found that spiritual achievement narratives correlate strongly with defensive self-enhancement, exactly what genuine awakening is supposed to dissolve. Tolle explains that consciousness isn't something you have, it's what you are. The question, what level am I at, comes from the ego's need to measure, compare, and position itself in a hierarchy. True presence has no interest in such questions. When you're genuinely present, there's no one there to claim a level. Consciousness simply is, aware, alert, alive, without needing to announce itself or compete for position. The trap is subtle. Spiritual frameworks, chakras, planes of existence, stages of enlightenment can be useful maps. But the moment you use them to establish your spiritual superiority, they become ego weapons. Watch for this in yourself. If you feel a subtle sense of pride when contemplating your spiritual development, that's the ego. If you find yourself mentally comparing your practice to others, that's the ego. If you're tempted to casually mention your meditation hours or your energy sensitivity, that's the ego seeking validation. The awakened response to "what consciousness level are you?" is silence, or better, genuine confusion about what the question even means. The third thing you must never reveal: your private spiritual practices. The Sermon on the Mount contains a teaching that Tolle frequently references. When you pray, go into your room and shut the door. This isn't about religious ritual, it's about protecting the sacred from ego contamination. The moment you announce your spiritual practices, I meditate 2 hours daily, I do Kundalini yoga, I practice Vipassana, you've converted practice into identity. The practice is no longer a tool for presence, it's become a badge of spiritual status. Research from 2025 on intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation in contemplative practices found that people who publicly share their meditation routines show significantly lower actual consciousness benefits than those who practice silently. The study suggests that public declaration of practice activates reward circuits associated with social status, rather than the neural patterns associated with genuine equanimity. Tolle warns that spiritual practices are particularly vulnerable to ego hijacking because they feel virtuous. The ego loves virtue. It's the perfect disguise for continued self-focus. Notice the subtle pride that arises when someone asks about your spiritual life, and you get to list your practices. That pride is the ego saying, "Look how evolved I am." The practice has become performance. This doesn't mean you can never discuss practices with a genuine teacher or fellow practitioners in appropriate contexts, but casual announcement of your spiritual resume, that's ego. True practice transforms you in silence. Its fruits show in how you respond to difficulty, how present you are in ordinary moments, how little you need others to know about your spiritual life. When your practice becomes genuinely transformative, people might sense something different about you, a quality of presence, an unusual capacity for stillness, but they won't be able to point to any announcement you made. The transformation speaks through your being, not your words. The fourth thing you must never reveal: your insights about others' consciousness. One of the most dangerous forms of spiritual narcissism is using your awakening to judge others' consciousness levels. She's still very identified with ego. He hasn't awakened to his pain body yet. They're operating from unconscious patterns. Eckhart Tolle would recognize this immediately. The ego has disguised itself as spiritual discernment. It's put on a costume. Research from 2024 on spiritual bypassing, using spiritual concepts to avoid genuine psychological work, identifies this exact pattern. People who frequently diagnose others' consciousness levels show higher rates of unprocessed shadow material and interpersonal conflict than those who don't engage in such analysis. It's a sign of something within them that needs addressing. The trap works like this. Genuine awakening does bring increased clarity about unconscious patterns in yourself and others. You might clearly see when someone is operating from ego reactivity, when pain body is active, when identification with thinking has taken over. But the moment you use this perception to establish your spiritual superiority, even privately in your own mind, you've fallen into the ego's most sophisticated trap. It's like a spiritual judo move. The ego uses your own strength against you. True presence sees unconsciousness with compassion, not judgment. It recognizes that everyone, including you, moves in and out of identification. There's no stable I that has permanently transcended while others lag behind. Eckhart Tolle teaches that when you truly see unconsciousness in another, there's an immediate recognition. That's what it looks like when awareness forgets itself. Not look how unconscious they are compared to me. The distinction is subtle, but total. One response comes from presence recognizing itself. The other comes from ego establishing hierarchy, building a spiritual ladder to climb. Watch for spiritual gossip in communities, people analyzing each other's consciousness, comparing notes on who's really awake and who's just performing. This is ego activity dressed in spiritual language. It's like a potluck where everyone is secretly judging each other's dishes. The truly awake response to perceiving unconsciousness in others is silence, and often a deepened humility about how easily awareness forgets itself in everyone, including you. The fifth thing you must never reveal: your perception of reality shifts. As presence deepens, you begin to perceive reality differently. Time feels less linear. Synchronicities multiply. The boundary between inner and outer becomes permeable. What seemed solid reveals itself as fluid, like looking at the world through a kaleidoscope. These are genuine shifts in perception that often accompany awakening. But the moment you start announcing them, I'm seeing through the illusion. Reality is revealing itself to me. I perceive dimensions others don't. The ego has hijacked the shift. It's like winning the lottery and immediately bragging about it to everyone. Eckhart Tolle warns about this specific trap in The Power of Now. He explains that altered perception isn't the goal. Presence is. Perception shifts are side effects, not achievements. When you start collecting them as evidence of your spiritual advancement, you've missed the point entirely. Research from 2025 on metacognition in meditation practitioners found a disturbing pattern. People who frequently discuss their altered perceptions show lower actual meditation depth than those who don't. The researchers suggest that talking about perception shifts activates analytical, conceptual thinking, exactly what prevents genuine presence. It's like trying to understand a joke by overanalyzing it. You kill the humor. The trap intensifies in spiritual communities where people subtly compete over who perceives more, who's more sensitive to energy, who receives clearer downloads. This isn't awakening. It's ego establishing dominance through spiritual one-upmanship, like a spiritual talent show where everyone is vying for attention. True shifts in perception don't need announcement. They quietly transform how you relate to life. You become less reactive, more spacious, naturally compassionate, not because you're trying, but because the perceptual shift makes reactivity feel foreign. It's a natural byproduct. When someone asks about your spiritual experiences, the awakened response isn't to catalog your perception shifts. It's to recognize that presence itself is the shift, and presence doesn't talk about itself. It simply is. Silence protects the perception shift from becoming another object the ego possesses and displays. Another trophy on the shelf? The sixth thing you must never reveal: your dark night challenges. The spiritual path isn't linear progress toward light. It includes what contemplatives call the dark night, periods of profound disorientation, loss of meaning, dissolution of previous certainties. It's like wandering through a dense fog, unsure of where you are going. Eckhart Tolle experienced this personally before his awakening at age 29. He describes months of intense suffering where his entire worldview collapsed. This wasn't failure, it was preparation for transformation, a crucible of sorts. But here's the trap. When you emerge from a dark night, the ego wants to claim it as a heroic journey. I went through ego death. I survived my dark night. I faced the void. The moment you narrate your dark night as an achievement, you've converted genuine spiritual crucifixion into an ego trophy. Something to brag about at a cocktail party. Research from 2024 on post-traumatic growth in spiritual contexts found that people who frequently recount their dark night experiences show markers of spiritual bypassing. Using spiritual language to avoid genuine integration of difficult material, the study suggests that repeated narration of spiritual crisis can become a way to avoid the actual transformation that crisis was preparing. It becomes a story you tell yourself, rather than a lesson you integrate. Eckhart Tolle teaches that the dark night serves a specific function. It destroys your attachment to conceptual understanding, including your concept of yourself as a spiritual seeker. When you convert that destruction into a story about your spiritual heroism, you've rebuilt exactly what the dark night was dismantling. You've missed the entire point. True integration of dark night experiences shows in increased humility, not increased spiritual status. You don't talk about what you survived. You simply carry less ego, less need to understand, less attachment to spiritual identity. Watch for this in spiritual communities. People who constantly reference their dark nights, their ego deaths, their void experiences. Often this signals unintegrated material, the ego claiming the dark night instead of being destroyed by it. It's like wearing your battle scars as a fashion statement. The genuinely transformed response to dark night experience is silence, or when appropriate, simple acknowledgement that transformation often involves complete disorientation. No heroic narrative, no claim to special suffering. Just the quiet understanding that sometimes you have to lose your way to find your way. The seventh thing you must never reveal: your complete spiritual journey. This is the most comprehensive trap. Converting your entire spiritual path into a narrative identity. I was lost, then I found meditation, then I had my awakening, now I'm helping others wake up. This sounds inspiring. It follows every hero's journey template, and it's precisely how the ego hijacks genuine transformation. Eckhart Tolle explains that awakening isn't a journey from point A to point B that you accomplish. It's the recognition that there is no separate you to make a journey. The one who would claim spiritual accomplishment is the illusion being seen through. Research from 2025 on narrative identity and spiritual development found that people with highly developed spiritual journey narratives show measurably higher ego defensiveness than those without such narratives. The study suggests that spiritual story-making can become a sophisticated form of self-protection, the ego creating an invulnerable spiritual identity. This pattern appears everywhere in spiritual culture. Teachers who constantly reference their awakening story, practitioners who've rehearsed their spiritual autobiography, people whose entire identity centers on being the one who awakened. True awakening doesn't produce a better story. It dissolves the need for a story. This doesn't mean you can never share relevant experiences when teaching or genuinely helping someone, but casual recitation of your spiritual resume, that's ego-seeking validation. Eckhart Tolle himself rarely discusses his personal awakening experience, except when directly relevant to teaching. His focus isn't on, "Look what happened to me." It's on pointing to presence available right now, regardless of anyone's history. When presence is genuine, your past spiritual journey becomes increasingly irrelevant. What matters is this moment, whether awareness is here now, not what happened 5 years ago, or what you accomplished yesterday. The test is simple. Notice what happens when you're prevented from telling your spiritual story. If frustration arises, if you feel unseen or invalidated, that's the ego. The awakened being has no story it needs others to know. The real teaching behind the silence. You might be wondering, if all these things must remain unspoken, what is spirituality about? Tolle's answer is radical. True awakening is the end of being special. Including spiritually special, silence about these 7 things isn't secrecy. It's conscious protection from the ego's most sophisticated strategy, turning awakening itself into a new identity to defend. Research on the psychology of spiritual identity from 2024 found that the most reliably transformed individuals, those showing genuine compassion, equanimity, and presence, are the least likely to discuss their spiritual status. The study's conclusion aligns perfectly with Tolle's teaching. Real transformation shows in your being, not your story. When you genuinely awaken, something paradoxical happens. You become simultaneously more available and less interested in being seen as awakened. Presence naturally arises in interactions, but there's no one claiming credit for it. The silence Tolle recommends isn't about hiding. It's about not feeding the ego's need to be recognized as spiritually superior. Every time you resist the urge to announce your mystical experience, claim your consciousness level, list your practices, diagnose others, describe your perception shifts, recount your dark night, or rehearse your spiritual journey. You're starving the spiritual narcissism that masquerades as awakening. This is difficult because genuine spiritual development does occur. You do become more conscious. Insights do arise. Transformation does happen. The challenge is holding these developments without converting them into identity. Tolle offers a simple test. Notice the difference between sharing something because it might genuinely help someone in this specific moment versus sharing to establish your spiritual credentials. The first comes from presence. The second comes from ego. Most spiritual sharing is the second type. Disguised as the first, the ultimate protection, ordinariness. Here's what Tolle knows and research confirms. Truly awakened people are remarkably ordinary. They don't walk around announcing their consciousness. They don't need others to know about their practices or insights. They don't wear their dark nights as badges of honor. They don't convert their awakening into a superior identity. They're simply present, more available, more peaceful, more genuinely compassionate than most people. But you might not notice anything obviously spiritual about them. This ordinariness is the ultimate protection against spiritual narcissism. When awakening is real, you don't become more special. You become more human, less defended, less performing, less needing others to recognize your spiritual status. The 7 things you never reveal aren't secrets you're keeping. They're simply aspects of your inner life that don't need external validation, and protecting them from ego exploitation is how genuine transformation survives. Final warning from Tolle. Tolle's most crucial warning about all of this: the ego is incredibly subtle. It can read this entire teaching and within minutes find a way to use it for self-enhancement. Look how humble I am about my spirituality. I'm evolved enough not to talk about my awakening. I've transcended the need for spiritual recognition. Each statement is ego claiming credit for humility. The trap never ends until you see that there's no one to claim anything, including the claim of having no claims. This is why the teaching points to silence, not as a rule to follow, that just creates a new ego identity as the silent spiritual person, but as recognition that presence itself has nothing to prove, nothing to announce, nothing to establish. When you're genuinely present, the 7 things this teaching mentions aren't things you're deliberately hiding. They're simply irrelevant to the alive stillness that's here now. And that stillness doesn't talk about itself. It simply is.